I'm Todd Shelnut with CFI Pro Courses, and today I have a very exciting video for you. And this has been something that's been requested a few times, and that is how to conduct a flight review. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today in all the aspects of it. So without further ado, let's get started.
We're going to be looking at Advisory Circular 61-98. And just remember, for professional reasons, you never want to quote the last letter if you're actually going to have some type of something that's going to stay on the internet for a while, simply because we don't want this to be outdated in the future. So I don't ever say the last letter. I'll just say the most current 61-98, and that will suffice for conversational purpose, educational purposes, the most current AC 61-98. Now, up until recently, the FAA had a couple of different publications. One was the Advisory Circular. The next one was a nice, colorful brochure for the instrument proficiency check, as well as the flight review. They did away with those. They're no longer available. You can't even find them on the FAA's website anymore. But you can still find them in Google searches, and they are still relevant. So if you happen to see those, just remember that the FAA doesn't produce those anymore. They don't keep them up current. So if you do decide to work from them, it won't be the most current items used within the field. So here is the AC 61-98, and we'll go ahead and come into the document here on this one. And again, this is in advisory circular format, so it looks like it is a bunch, like it's a very heavy read, but it's really not. It's only 49 pages, and if you're doing the flight review, it's only about maybe a third of those pages, because a part of this again deals with currency requirements, and some of this deals with instrument proficiency check. So let's come down here and actually look page by page and see what we have in regards to the flight review. So we have our introductory page here, and then we have our contents. And I think the biggest thing here is that you can see it's just like everything that the FAA has, it's always divided into chapters and subparts. So we have Chapter 1 General, which is basically some good light reading. It's only 5 pages there, but not anything that's really going to stand out. Chapter 2 is basically just talking about how to reduce aviation accidents. Chapter 3 is dealing with the recency of flight experience, which is basically 61.57 expanded. And then we have the one that we're looking at here, which is Chapter 4. So I'm going to go ahead and go to Chapter 4. And there's a couple of pages here in Chapter 4, and it talks about the flight review and what that means to you as a flight instructor, because you as a flight instructor are able to do these things, so you must know how to do it. And in the check ride, the examiner is going to ask you, how do you conduct a flight review? And you have to be able to tell them how you're going to do it. So let's look and see what the advisory circular says for the flight review.
Okay, so I've blown this up nice and big so you can see here where it starts in the advisory circular. And this is Chapter 4 within the advisory circular. And let's start off by looking at the top. There's just a few pages here, and then I'm going to tell you exactly how to conduct the flight review by using the tools within inside of this advisory circular. So it starts off by saying that the purpose of the flight review was because it's required by the regulations under 6156. And this is so that you give a regular evaluation of pilot skills and aeronautical knowledge. Now, one of the things that it starts right in the very front is to tell you as a flight instructor, and also to let your client know, that this is not a test and it is not a check ride, but rather a training event of which proficiency is evaluated. So that means this is something that is not failable. You would simply just make another arrangement to have the person come out. Say you did a flight review flight with them and it didn't turn out good. The guy couldn't hold altitude. The student couldn't do this. They couldn't do that. No problem. You just make another scheduled event for them to come out to the airport, and you're going to fly with them until they meet the standards. And the standards they're going to meet are whatever grade of pilot certificate that they hold. So if they're a private pilot, you're going to do it to private standards of the ACS. If they're a commercial, they're going to do it to commercial standards of the ACS. And what do you do on this flight review? Well, we know we have to do 1 hour of flight and 1 hour of ground. We've all heard that. And if you put that together, it seems like you may be at the airport for only 2 hours. This is not a 2-hour event. It's actually a several hour event, or maybe even a couple of days. So the first day you may meet, you'll do the ground portion, and it's very difficult to like introduce yourself and get started and be settled into it, and then do 1 hour of ground and cover everything that they want you to cover. It's actually quite difficult. Even at my stage, I've never been able to do the ground portion in just 1 hour. So I would expect that you would do the ground on one day and you would do the flight on another day. Otherwise, this may turn into a 4 to 5, maybe even 6-hour event at the airport from the time they walk in the door to the flight school to the time that they leave. So this is a very extensive training flight and training mission for you as a flight instructor. Okay, so you must understand 6156 and read and review it, and this document is going to help you do that. So let's continue forward. If the pilot does not demonstrate the proficiency to conduct safe flight, then more training is required. Like I said, there is no endorsement that is required for an unsatisfactory flight review. You would simply just invite him back out for another training flight, and you would sign that flight that you did in the first attempt for the flight review as a normal training flight. It's up to you whether or not you put any comments in there like flight review first attempt, but don't demean the pilot by doing that. Just simply give them what they came for. Try to work with them, because that's what's going to make the client come back to you to get more flight instruction in the future and increase your revenue. So you don't want to make them feel bad about their performance, okay? All right, let's keep going. Since satisfactory completion of a flight review is based on pilot proficiency, it is up to the instructional service provider to determine what type of instruction is required. And I'm going to show you specifically how to do that in just a minute using this advisor circular. So we'll table that idea. And it says here, while flight instructors are encouraged to manage the expectations of the pilot under review and discuss the outline of the flight review with the pilot, it is the flight instructor that ultimately determines the total training time required for a flight review, which means that it's the 1 hour of ground and 1 hour of flight is the absolute bare bones minimum that you would actually have to have. And the FAA is basically stating that they're going to put it upon you to ensure that you do everything required to make sure that client meets the expectations of the flight review. So let's look now at the structure of the flight review. There's a couple of notes here, and then we're going to bypass all of this and go down to the bottom where the nice juicy stuff is at the bottom. Here it just talks about some little areas here that would. Here it just talks about some areas here that's really not a lot of good information here with the training environment and the FAA following the recommended guidance. We're going to get all that stuff at the bottom. The FAA just puts a lot of junk wording in here, and it's not a lot in here that's really going to apply to you up here in this bulk text. Here it says accomplishing a flight review. No person, so under the regulations, it says no person may act as pilot in command of an aircraft, and that is it. So that you can do anything else, you can flight train, you can do any other things that you want to do, but you can't act as PIC of the aircraft unless you've had one of these flight reviews within the preceding 24 calendar months, okay? And what are the other ways you can do it? Well, you can also complete a part of the WINGS program. So besides going to the airport and talking with a flight instructor, you can actually go to FAAsafety.gov and complete one or more phases of the FAA's Pilot Proficiency awards program. Now, this is what I choose to do. I don't like doing an all-out flight review. I like choosing very specific training flights, and I'll go to my flight instructor and say, hey, I'd like to do these wings flights. And after I do probably 3 flights or more, then that ends up being my flight review. And I get a flight review about once every 12 months. So I don't wait 24 months. I go off the FAA's recommended time of proficiency evaluating, and that is once every 12 months. So the Pilot Proficiency Awards program is every 12 months. You can only use the program credits for 12 months. So every 12 months, if you are in the Wings program, you can have your customer come back to you and spend money with you and build flight time with you and build more rapport and build more people if you use the Wings program, because you'll see them every 12 months. At a minimum, because you're going to be flying with them probably once a quarter, okay? And then once they get the word out that you're a good instructor and you're helping them do this Wings program, then you won't have to wait one day every 24 months to create revenue and flight time and to build yourself up as a flight instructor. All right, so another thing you could do too is to complete a proficiency check or a rating. So another way to get a flight review would be to pass a check ride. So if you take a check ride, it doesn't matter what check ride it is, you take a check ride, you are going to receive credit for a flight review. Now, this is also a pretty easy thing to do for your customers as well. As a flight instructor, you actually have the ability to issue Wings credit. And I'm going to have a special video just for that this month in May that's going to tell you specifically how to use the FAA Wings program to give your current clients credit whenever they pass a check ride. Okay, this is in addition to doing a Wings flight with them, and that video will follow after this video. Okay, so that's another way to do it. And then down here it says, however, the FAA recommends that pilots consider also accomplishing a flight review under some of the following circumstances. For example, a pilot with an airplane single engine land rating may have recently obtained a glider rating, but still wish to consider obtaining a flight review in a single engine airplane if that 24 months expired. And what it means by that is if you have several different type of aircraft on your pilot certificate, you may want to consider doing something, some type of proficiency, something in those particular aircraft once every 24 months. And that's what that is saying. All right, so let's go down to some of the pre-review considerations. So down here we want to talk about what should we think about as a flight instructor prior to giving the flight review. Well, one of them is the type of equipment that you're going to be flying. And it says here that to act as PIC, a pilot must accomplish a flight review in an aircraft for which the pilot is rated. And it goes on to say a pilot might hold multiple ratings. In such cases, the pilot may take a flight review in any of the aircraft. So you don't have to, like we were talking about earlier, having more than one type of aircraft on their pilot certificate. You only need to do it in one of those aircraft to get the flight review. So if you hold a balloon rating, you could do it in a balloon, and that would cover your flight review for everything. All right. So let's see. It does say down here, however, a pilot may not take a flight review in an aircraft for which he or she does not hold a rating or operating privilege. Well, that seems like a big duh, but of course the FAA wouldn't have put it in there if it wasn't something that needed to be talked about. So at some point, some knucklehead tried to go out and do a flight review in some aircraft they weren't even rated in, and of course that doesn't do that as well. And I guess another thing too to mention is that student pilots, that's a lot of things I get a question of. Does a student pilot need a flight review if they've been a student pilot for more than 24 calendar months? And the answer is no. So the flight review doesn't actually apply to student pilots. All right. So let's go down, keep on going down here, and it talks about the maneuvers and procedures varying, just a repeat about what we talked above. And it does make a difference whether you're talking about if the airplane's a high performance or complex or the make and model. So that's very important to you to consider as a flight instructor before you get in the airplane with them, to know exactly how much experience they may have in there so you can build a flight review based off of that. Now, another thing they talk about is the nature of the flight operation. So what has the pilot been doing? And that is very important as well. Again, there's just a brief thing here that talks about that. But again, I'm going to cover this down below in a little sheet that you're going to give your client, and it'll actually tell you how you are going to conduct the flight review. Some things to also consider is amount of recency of flight experience. Is the person an airline pilot or are they a recreational pilot? You have to be very careful. Also, again, if you go back up to the aircraft, if a person's been flying a 777 and now they want to come down to the local airport and for some reason get a flight review with you, they may not be the best person right as you start working with them in the airplane as far as piloting is concerned, because jet jocks don't do good when they get back into a piston airplane and vice versa. So that's another thing too, the recency of experience and the amount of experience that they have. You may not see the best quality of flying even out of some of the more experienced pilots, okay? Agreement on the conduct of the flight review. You want to make sure that you're very, very clear up front with the customer and tell them exactly what you are going to do on the flight review. Again, I have a form I'm going to show you in just a minute that you're going to fill out with them, and that will cover all of that information. Instructor qualifications. Now, instructor qualifications, it says here, instructors should also consider their own experience and qualifications in a given make and model aircraft prior to giving a flight review in that model. I have given flight reviews in models of airplanes that I had never flown before, and I want to tell you, I was a little bit apprehensive about that, because if anything would have went wrong, if the guy would have, the person I was doing a flight review with would have passed out or something, I would have really had to pull myself up by the bootstraps and start really digging deep into my skills of a pilot to figure out an airplane that I've never flown before. That can be a pretty scary thing. So how can you limit that? Well, what you can do is just ask the person to do a couple of flights with you beforehand, and that way you become a little bit more acclimated with the airplane. Maybe even go get the POH and search through that a little bit before you actually do the flight review. All right, planning and recording the flight review. So in addition to considering the information in this chapter for the appendixes that we're going to look at below, it says that you can use the FAA's online guidance, conducting an effective flight review, available there, but it's not there. It is gone. So that link is no good. If I clicked on that link, it'll tell you that the product is no longer there. So please don't try to look for that product. They used to have it, but it is gone. The advisory circular took the place. And now that actually is effective only recently. February of 2020 is where you would find that. And the rest of this material here basically talks about how you're going to use the forms down below. There's one more thing we want to talk about here, and that is pilot deviations. Just remember that when you are on the flight review, if it is an air, you may have a lot of things in your mind going on, but you still have to make sure that you are, as the flight instructor, are not committing any deviations, no incidents or anything like that. And you want to make sure that the person has very good runway incursion avoidance. You don't want to get into a situation in which you were in a ground PD and you're going to have to suffer the wrath of the FAA over that. So at the bottom here, it says the flight review may be the only regular proficiency and recurrency training experienced by some pilots. Therefore, flight instructors should place appropriate emphasis on this part of the flight review, because they're not constantly thinking about these things when they're out there, because they just want to go flying. They love flying. Flying's so fun. All these things like ADM and cockpit resource management and, incidents, and they're not thinking about those things. They're just thinking about how cool it is to fly. So you have to really make sure that you take care of that. Automation competency. If the person has any type of automation in the airplane, you need to check them on it and make sure they understand how to use it. It is very, very important, especially with the growing of technologically advanced aircrafts, or TAA for short. It's very important that they are reviewed on that. And Sometimes you may actually need to get specialized training in order to properly do a flight review so you can understand how to use that equipment as well, because there's a lot of things that actually go on there. If you are using an airplane that has an AOA system, please make sure that you train the person on the AOA system. So some of you listening to this broadcast may have never used an AOA system, and that's perfectly fine, because you can actually make yourself smarter by studying some of these things that you've never used before. Okay, so if it does have an AOA system on it, angle of attack system, please make sure that you do a little bit of research and you are able to talk about that in the flight review as a professional. Going over the review of the maneuvers and procedures. The maneuvers and procedures are going to be solely based on what the person's doing and what type of quality of flying that they're doing. And you can just make these up as you see fit. Again, I'm telling you that if you go down below here, there's going to be some things that you can actually see that are going to make this whole entire thing very easy. But they do provide a lot of text in here trying to give you some instruction based off this. Just a couple more paragraphs here of things that you want to make sure you at least cover these experiences, these items, regardless of the pilot's experience. So takeoffs, stabilized approaches to landings, and slow flight, stall recognition, stall recovery, spin recognition and avoidance, recovery from unusual attitudes, and operating the aircraft by sole reference to instruments under actual or simulated conditions. Okay, so those you absolutely positively want to do, and then you're going to add to it. So if the FAA says, well, what did you do with this person? You better at least say those 7 items right there, because those are the most important ones. And then, again, it says, based off your assessment of the pilot skills, the flight instructor may wish to add other maneuvers from the PTS or ACS appropriate to the pilot's grade or certificate. Again, as we get down to the bottom here, you're going to be so incredibly happy, because I've already said that like 12 times about the bottom of this document. Now, I'm going to get there, I promise you, in just a minute. And again, remember, like I said earlier, the role of the flight instructor is just to provide an evaluation. You are not an examiner. You are not an aviation safety inspector. So don't think that that's what you are. Be very nice to the customer, because it may have been a while since they've flown, and you don't want to make them feel bad about their lack of performance in the flight, okay? Let's talk about some post-review considerations, and this is really an easy thing that I've already talked about when we're at the top of the document, and that is if the person does good and you feel that their flight review went well, you're going to issue an endorsement, which is found in the Advisory Circular 6165, most current version of that. And then if they don't do good, then you don't do anything. You just mark it down as dual given, and you invite them back out to the airport again to do another training flight. Now, there's a kind of a stipulation side of this, and that is, what if the person is absolutely terrible? I mean, they can't do anything right, and you basically were in fear of your life almost the entire flight. Well, you actually have a responsibility, and that is, if you cannot convince that person to continue training with you and to come back out to another flight, you do have a responsibility to actually contact your local FSDO and report that pilot and have the FAA reach out to them and follow up with that person to make sure that they get some type of proficiency before they get into the air again, because you actually do have a responsibility for that. So please make sure that you understand that. All right, so that's it with that. Instrument proficiency check we're going to come back to for a later one. But let's keep on going down here to the appendix. And this is going to be all the nice and juicy information for you on this. And let's scroll down. It starts right here on this form. And it says, this is this sample of an airplane pilot proficiencies practice plan. So after the flight review is over, or if you have a brand new pilot that you just made, like if you just made a private pilot, you want to put them on a proficiency practice plan. And this is what you're going to do. You're going to give them this sheet and you're going to say, look, this is what I want you to do. And we're going to come back about every 4 to 6 weeks and you're going to have to practice these things. And this is how I'm going to make you stay proficient as a pilot. All right. And so this is a good form, and you can copy this into another document and make up your own. You can put your logos, you can put your name at the bottom of it and dress it up. None of this stuff is copyrighted information. It all belongs to the government, so have your will at it. But this is a great form for keeping your current clients proficiency and creating a practice plan for them. So that's what that is. Let's look at our next document down here. The next one is going to be the goals of the pilot. So as you're creating a file for your customer, you want to be able to find out where do they want to go and what do they want to do. And this is something, again, that you can just copy the information onto another form. You can make up your own, and you can put your name down at the bottom, Joe Pilot and Flight School of Aeronautics. And you can basically make everybody fill one of these out who come into you for a flight review. And that way you can continue to build your clientele, continue to build flight time, continue to build revenue, because you're keeping track of what motivates people and their goals. And that is literally chapter 1 and 2 of the Aviation Instructor's Handbook. And that's something that we have to do with our students. All right, let's look at the next one that we have here. Now, this is actually what you're going to give to your student prior to doing the check ride. So your client walks into the school and they say, I would like a flight review. And then you're going to say, okay. And you're going to pull out this form and you're going to say, this is what we're going to do. And this is what I need from you prior to doing the flight review. And you can have them fill it out down here at the bottom here. We have the pilot and flight instructor address, email, and all the certificates they have and the ratings and their experience and all the aircraft and the flight environment and the type of flying and the personal skills. And you can tell them, they say, this is basically this 5-step process is what you and I are going to go over on the flight review. So you can take this with you if you would, fill it back out, send it back to me, take a picture of it, send it back to me. So that way I can plan on what to do on your flight review. So you want to get them to fill this form out and send it back to you plenty enough time so that way you can develop and summarize a training plan of action for your client. All right, there's something very similar to this down below, but this is actually for the client that they're going to give to you. Let's look at another form down here. So you're probably asking yourself, well, I don't know what to go over for Part 91. Well, it's perfectly okay, no problem. It actually tells you here that the very first thing is actually in Part 61. So the FAA says 1 hour of flight review under the Part 91, but here it actually talks about Part 61. So you want to go down through each one of these items, and you want to talk about each one of these items and maybe have a little story or something behind each one of these items. But there are 2 pages of these things, and you want to be familiar with these regulations. So you're going to have to do some review, and you're going to have to reach out there and say, what do I need to know about this information before you do your check ride? Because you're going to have to answer questions probably about these items. So you want to make sure you stay ahead of it and look over this stuff prior to giving the check ride. Again, here's the side 2 there, the rest of the stuff that you have to work on. And it also gives some other things down at the bottom, like your personal minimums worksheet. Could also be your PAVE checklist, talking about risk management and the standards for any check ride. Now, this next form is my favorite form that I like to have, and I actually have one that I've developed for me personally. I'm not going to show you mine, but I will show you this generic one. And this is the checklist that I actually get, and I staple this with the sheet that the person gave me that we looked at before, which has that I asked them to take home and fill out. And I'm going to staple these together, and it's got all the information on it. And I'm going to put this in my flight instructor records, because if the FAA comes back and says, hey, did you give this person a flight review? And I'm like, yep. And they go, what did you do? And I go, well, let me show you. And I'm going to pull out their file and I'm going to say, this is what I did. And I can go over all this stuff with them and say, this is what I did. And so don't tell me that they did something stupid, because they did really good in the thing, in the flight review. So, you know, if they did something stupid outside of this, I don't know what to tell you, but they did phenomenal. Otherwise, I would never have given them a flight review. So here's some reference information here on the side, which is, we already know about that. We've talked about that before. Unless you're a military person, we didn't talk about that. And that is this little portion right in here, but you can just read that at your own leisure. And then there is the endorsement at the bottom if you are going to endorse them for the flight review. And then there is a statement there saying no logbook entry reflecting unsatisfactory performance on a flight review is required. And if you look at this, it's such an easy thing to really go over. Here's the back side of that, all the information. So as you go through the ground portion, you can just click those, check those off one at a time there. And when you get to the end of it, you're done. And now you have a formal sheet here that says, I did this, and you can keep the person's information on file. And what a glorious thing for you to do. And it's really going to make you look like a pro, because you've got all this information already typed up, already ready, and you've looked it over already. And the person's going to want to come back and do all their flight reviews with you, because they've learned so much, and they're going to tell other pilots about you, and you're going to build them more flight time and more revenue. Okay, so here's another thing too. This is basically the rest of this stuff here is all about the instrument experience. So we really don't care about that. That's because if you're going to do an IPC, and again, that just goes all the way down there. So none of the rest of this stuff, you can see it's laid out just like the flight review. So really none of this stuff applies to us. And that is actually how you are going to do a flight review. Isn't that cool? And again, you can use this advisory circular here. It's a free download on the FAA's website here. It's advisory circular 61-98 Delta. I will also put a PDF copy of this down below, and so that way you won't have to go search for it. I'll just put it down here in the comments. And there's a couple of things I want to talk to you about before we actually wrap up this video, and that is a couple of instances in which this may come up on the check ride. So one way it would come up on the check ride is the examiner would say, all right, you're at the flight school, you're sitting around on the couch watching TV, and the door opens up and this guy walks in and he says, hey, I'd like a flight review. And I'd like to be able to do that now if you have time. And you're like, well, yeah, I've got time. And then, so they want to know, how are you going to do it? And so your response would be, I'm going to pull out my advisory circular 6198D, and I'm going to pull out those sheets, and I'm going to sit down with my new client, and I'm going to have them fill out this stuff, and I'm going to talk with them first and see about how I can develop a plan of action for the flight today. All right. And then I'm going to do everything that is on that sheet, and then I can do the flight review and give them the endorsement. Now, the examiners also like to ask questions going the other way, meaning that you did a flight review with someone, they did not meet standards, they didn't do very good. What is your responsibility as a flight instructor? And that would be nothing. You have no responsibility at that point except for to invite the person back for another training flight. And that way you could kind of keep the person coming in, and you could continue working with them until they do meet the requirements. And then eventually when they do meet all the requirements and they meet all of the standards, then you could give them an endorsement for the flight review. And I would keep that with my instructor records, of course, for 3 years, even though the regulations under Part 61 do not require you, 61-189 does not require you to keep records of flight review. I would keep a record of any flight review that you have done, because I have seen the FAA go back and ask instructors of pilots that had an incident or an accident, and they asked what they did on the flight review, and they wanted to see some type of proof of it. So that's the way that the flight review would come up on this. Another way I've heard examiners asking this is you have a rotorcraft pilot come into your airplane flight school, and he wants to do a flight review in the airplane while he's training to do his add-on rating. Is that possible? And the answer is no, because we've already talked about that at the front part of this, saying that you actually have to be rated in the aircraft that you're going to receive your flight review in. All right, well, I hope this answers all of your questions about flight reviews, and if there's anything that I can do for you, please make sure that you post your comments and questions down below or send me direct messaging. You have that way through my Patreon or YouTube account, and I would love to be able to interact with you more and answer any questions you may have. Thanks so much for joining me, everybody. I'm Todd Shellent with CFI Pro Courses. So long.